Hello, my name is Phillip Zapkin. I'm an assistant teaching professor of English at Pennsylvania State University in the United States. And I want to thank, first off, the organizers of the Adaptation in the Humanities conference for putting this all together. And I'd like to thank you, those of you who are going to show up for the panel discussion in which we talk about my work as well as my co-presenter's work. So my paper is entitled Analytical Engine, Computers, Prophecy, and the Paradox of Fate in Walid Ikhlasi Oedipus. Although this is a presentation about a Syrian theatrical adaptation of the Oedipus myth, I want to start with two quite different sketches. First, a brief bit of dialogue from the Star Trek original series episode The Way to Eden. After Ensign Chekhov tells Irina, his former lover and current space hippie/starship hijacker, that the computer knows enough to run the ship, she summarizes. The computers tell you what to do, and you do what they tell you. Chekhov says, no, we use our own judgment also. Irina says, I could never obey a computer. Chekhov says, you could never listen to anyone. You always had to be different. Just imagine that with Russian accents. So second, an observation from my own Facebook feed. Recently, Facebook began showing me ads for a company called Quaker Marine Supply Company, which I had never heard of, never bought from, never searched for on any search engine, etc. After seeing the ad several times, I finally decided to check their clothing out, and their products fit with my general aesthetic. Although I honestly have no idea whether playwright Walid Ikhlasi had seen Star Trek when he wrote his version of Oedipus in 1978, and he definitely didn't know about Facebook, I start the presentation by telling you these two things because the question of how much control computers have over our lives is at the heart of Ikhlasi's play. Sophocles' Oedipus the King raises questions about causality. Does fate drive Oedipus, or does knowing the prophecy engender his destiny? Ikhlasi's play Oedipus substitutes a predictive supercomputer for the Delphic oracle, raising the causal stakes for modern audiences. This paper argues that Ikhlasi's play poses crucial questions about humanity's interactions with computers, particularly questions about control and dependence/independence. Ikhlasi's play hews fairly close to the Sophocles version, but with some important differences. Ikhlasi sets his play in a modern, i.e. 1978, university computer laboratory. The computer scientist Dr. Al-Bahi's new computer program predicts his friend Dr. Sufyan, a geologist who's skeptical of computers, will impregnate his daughter, kill the one he loves most, and fail to find death. Sufyan ridicules this seemingly absurd idea as prophecies as trivial as those fabricated by seers and palm readers. The problem is that Sufyan only has a son, so the claim that he will get his daughter pregnant seems impossible. However, Sufyan is having an affair with Al-Bahi's young secretary Sulaf, who midway through the play announces that she's pregnant. When her father arrives, Sufyan recognizes that he had an affair with Sulaf's mother and that she is in fact his daughter. A revelation that prompts Sulaf to withdraw in horror and Sufyan to try to poison himself. While Sufyan writes his suicide note, his beloved son drinks the poison he had prepared for himself. In guilt and despair, Sufyan begs the computer to prophesy his death, asserting its power over his fate. The way Ikhlasi deals with fate and prophecy is strikingly similar to what happens in the Oedipus myth. Both protagonists receive a prophecy, Sufyan's from the computer and Oedipus's from the oracle at Delphi, that they will commit incest and murder a family member, and both question these prophecies. After Al-Bahi's computer gives the readout, Sufyan scoffs, your machine has produced nothing but bad prophecies. Similarly, Oedipus recounts to his wife Jocasta the prophecy that made him leave home. How mating with my mother I must spawn a progeny to make men shudder, having been my father's murderer. However, when a messenger brings word that Polybus, king of Corinth and ostensibly Oedipus's father, has died, both Oedipus and Jocasta mock Apollo and prophecy. Jocasta mocks, aha, forecasts of the gods, where are you now? How dwindled are the grand predictions of Apollo? And Oedipus says, so we are done with delving into Pythian oracles, this jangled mongering with birds on high. Well, Polybus is dead, and may he rest in in peace in Hades' realm with all those prophecies, worth nothing now. Despite these brief celebrations, Oedipus is, as we all know, nonetheless caught by fate when the shepherd reveals that he was Jocasta and Laius's baby transported to Corinth in secret, and that the man Oedipus killed on the road from Corinth was in fact his father. There's substantial scholarly debate about the power of fate in Greek tragedy, especially the paradigmatic example of Oedipus the king. There's an older and still popularly held belief that fate is the dominant force in tragedy, that characters are swept along by divine control rather than exercising any free will. And that's certainly the verdict offered by many tragic characters. And while there's definitely not a scholarly consensus on almost any issue related to Greek tragedy, however, most classicists and philosophers today accept some variation of the argument that tragedy runs on a combination of individual action and religiously oriented fate. Simon Critchley, for instance, claims tragedy requires some degree of complicity on our part in the disaster that destroys us. It is not simply a question of the malevolent activity of fate, a dark prophecy that flows from the inscrutable but often questionable will of the gods. Tragedy requires our collusion with that fate. In other words, it requires no small measure of freedom. What Critchley and others pursuing this line of reasoning assert is that although the power of the divine pervades the Greek worldview and tragedy as a genre, nonetheless, no tragic fate can come about without the tragic hero making free choices that lead to their fall. Richard Rader goes so far as to assert that tragedies show a lack of divinely mandated fate, and that characters instead merely use the vagaries of prophecy and retroactive declarations of fate to justify their own decisions. However, Oedipus the king does rather problematize this view because Oedipus is in full possession of the prophecy from before the beginning of Sophocles' play, so this is clearly not a retroactive attempt to avoid responsibility for Oedipus's own choices. However, as Stephen Hollowell argues, Oedipus the king is an example par excellence of the combination of fate and human choice. Hollowell writes, "Modern emphasis on Oedipus's own thrusting will and intellect has tended to replace older and too simple readings of a deterministic kind, but in the process what has sometimes been lost is the dramatic intimation of how the Apolline thread of Oedipus's life, asserting itself at a series of awesome junctures, yields results to which neither the purely human nor the uncompromising fate seems adequate." In other words, fate may drive Oedipus, but that fate could have been averted if the protagonist had not killed Laius over an insult at the crossroads, if he had not journeyed to Thebes, if he had not answered the Sphinx's riddle, if he had not married Jocasta, etc. Oedipus could have turned his fate aside at any moment, though it was only once the entire pattern of his life was revealed that the importance of these individual decisions became clear. Walid Ikhlasi takes up some of these questions of fate, free will, determinism, and human agency, but he puts them specifically in the context of the information age. Ikhlasi's plays run through with suggestions of fate's role, beginning right from the opening lines spoken by the chorus. What do they want to know? Everything indicates that life runs smoothly. All is in good order. Order, discipline, system, and significant power. What do they want to know? Prophecy belongs to the weather, to the ebb and flow of the tide, to those who fish in salty water. But behold who comes, who comes, who comes. The play therefore begins with a reference to prophecy, which will become a guiding theme, but it also introduces a sense of uncertainty. The repetition of the statement, "Who comes?" also suggests the question, "Who comes?" Introducing ambiguities about both Sulaf, who's on stage at the time, and Siphaen, who arrives. Their relationship as father and daughter is unknown at this point, so reading the chorus's repeated statement as a question opens up spaces for uncertainty. The thematic link of fate and prophecy is strengthened through a series of references to the Oedipus myth and to prophecy as Al-Bahi's computer makes its prediction of Siphaen's fate. Siphaen rejects the computer's claim, telling Al-Bahi, "Your creative machine has made me an Oedipus and turned itself into a playwright." And later, "Your machine wants to make me a fictional character like Oedipus." Fate seems to tease Sufyan with this Sophoclean identification when his son announces that he's been cast in the role of Oedipus for the school play, an announcement that enrages Sufyan. These overt references to Oedipus are Brechtian techniques highlighting the ambiguous role of fate in Ikhlasi's play through meta-theatrical allusions. Ikhlasi wants his audience to be constantly reminded of the mythical framework and its thematic emphasis on fate. The power of fate in Ikhlasi's Oedipus is, however, far from certain. Some critics of Ikhlasi's drama accept the controlling power of fate, but I think the play is much more ambivalent. Admir Gori writes, "At the end, Sufyan's proclaimed free will, his infatuation with reason, and his determination lead him to find himself a plaything of fate." And Safi Mahmoud Mahfouz points out that, unlike the Greek Oedipus, this Arab Oedipus does not search out the unbearable truth of unconsciously committing two horrible sins, incest and infanticide. Rather, the fatal truth seeks him out. He cannot avoid it. Although it's true that Sufyan does not, as Oedipus does in Sophocles, pursue the truth regardless of numerous warnings, seeing Sufyan merely as a pawn of fate also ignores his role in bringing about his downfall. Indeed, Ikhlasi ends his play by asking overtly whether Sufyan's fate was unavoidable or whether it was generated by the man himself. In almost the last line, al-Bahi wonders, has he turned himself into Oedipus, or was Oedipus latent in him without his knowledge? As with Oedipus, there are any number of choices Sufyan made that contributed to his eventual fate. He did not have to have an extramarital affair with Sulaf. He did not have to have an extramarital affair with Sulaf's mother decades earlier. He did not have to leave the poison unattended while going to write his suicide note, and so on. Ikhlasi's Oedipus aligns with the reading of tragedy that sees divine fate being carried out through human agency. Now, the issue of fate and the power of the divine is a preoccupation in Arab or Islamic adaptations of the Oedipus story, though they've traditionally done away with the capriciousness of the Greek gods. The Egyptian dramatists Tawfiq al-Hakim and Ali Ahmad Vakatir each wrote an Arabic adaptation of Oedipus the King in 1949, and both plays advanced the notion, rooted in Islam, of the supreme authority of the divine. In each play, the good king Oedipus is led astray by bad advisors. In al-Hakim's version, Tiresias tries to shape the destiny of Thebes and the monarchy through his own subterfuges, which are ultimately thwarted. And in Vakatir's play, the corrupt priest Lucasius turns Oedipus from the true Islamic path, but ultimately Oedipus, guided by Tiresias, who had been expelled from the priesthood, returns to devotion to Islam. According to Mahmoud al-Shatawi, al-Hakim's play shows what happens to man when he assumes the supremacy of his own will, regards himself as a god, and ignores or defies the existence of God. This same argument applies to Vakatir's version. Although in both of these adaptations the power of the divine to organize events is asserted, neither successfully works as tragedy, an argument developed in more detail by Mahfouz in his essay, The Arab Oedipus, Oriental Perspectives of the Myth. Essentially, the problem is that neither play melds Greek and Islamic philosophies into a coherent whole. In the introduction to his adaptation, al-Hakim writes, I had to strip the story of some of the superstitious beliefs that the Arab or Islamic mentality would scorn. Unfortunately, in stripping out the superstitious gods and elements, al-Hakim and Vakatir substantially reduced the tension between the prophecies of the gods and human activity, which thinkers like Critchley, Hollowell, and Rader assert is at the core of tragedy. Because Ikhlasi breaks from al-Hakim and Vakatir in not trying to Islamize the Oedipus story, his play is able to hew much closer to the original tragic ethos of Sophocles. It's because of Ikhlasi's particular approach to preserving the Sophoclean ambiguity that his play is perhaps more relevant for us today in 2021, even than when it premiered in 1978. And it's now that we return to the opening of this presentation. One of the principal philosophical questions posed by Ikhlasi's Oedipus is exactly the one raised in the Star Trek exchange. To what extent are our lives in modern society run by computers? Contemporary life is, of course, thoroughly preoccupied with this anxiety. From the Terminator films to WALL-E, From studies about social media's impact on teenagers' mental health to regular stories about corporate cyber breaches, and from congressional hearings about big tech's monopoly power to Edward Snowden's revelations about how much data the US government collects about its citizens, fears about the powers of tech abound. And these fears often envisage technology as some kind of all-powerful force which threatens to take over human destiny because computers have so much more access to information than any individual human. To paraphrase Irina, the computers tell us what to do, and we do what they tell us. However, as Ikhlasi's tragedy also reminds us, computers, like fate, do not function without human agency to drive them. This brings us to the targeted advertising on my Facebook page. Facebook did not arbitrarily decide that I would like Quaker Marine. They ran the data they've collected about me through predictive algorithms, a form of artificial intelligence increasingly at the heart of social media and targeted advertising across the internet, to determine my preferences. Big tech companies collate everything they know about us, which includes a massive amount of information given how much of our lives are lived online, even before the COVID-19 pandemic, to determine what advertisements to show us, what news sources we might want to read or watch, what videos we might enjoy, which people we might want to connect with, and so on. From the perspective of the end user, the seemingly automatic nature of this process can make the internet seem almost prophetic. However, Ikhlasi's play reminds us also of the mechanisms through which we provide the information crucial to predictive algorithms. When persuading Sufyan to participate in the experimental first run, al-Bahi tells him, "Feed this great machine with personal information and you will get answers. The more honest and precise you are, the deeper the computer's probing will penetrate." And when the prediction comes out, al-Bahi is unable to comprehend how the machine could possibly have come up with the result that it did, which indeed isn't a logical extrapolation from anything Sufyan told the computer. By the end of the play, al-Bahi is even more definite about the limitations of the computer's predictive modeling. As Sufyan begs the computer like an ancient Greek deity to put him out of his misery, al-Bahi tells him, "But the computer can't think without help." And this is the philosophical crux of the problem. The power of predictive algorithms, machine learning, and artificial intelligence can give technology an air of omnipotence. But, as with Greek tragedy, the efficiency of these mechanical processes requires human input, requires we choose to give our data. In 1978, Ikhlasi likely couldn't foresee how dependent society would become on computers, but from the perspective of 2021, Oedipus challenges us to consider how much power computers have over our lives. In reimagining the Sophoclean question of fate for a digital age, Ikhlasi asks whether computers drive us, or whether knowing what computers say engenders our collective destiny. Thank you.